Good evening and welcome to the Committee of the Whole meeting for December 9th, 2019. If you're tuning in and you want to follow along with our agenda tonight, then if you go to our website, livoniapublicschools.org, you can highlight over the school board tab, and it's a little bit different than it has been in the past. Then if you go to board meeting, I'm not sure what it is, board meeting information, and then down on the left you'll see meeting agendas. You can click on that and you'll see all of our agendas, and you can click on tonight's meeting and follow along with us. If you are here and you want to follow along, you can pick up an agenda outside of the door to the right, and they also have blue slips out there for anyone who wants to address the board. If you're tuning in to watch and listen to more in-depth discussion on our issues, this is the one that you want to tune into, because this is the one where we do a deeper dive, probably ask more questions, and get more information on our issues. So this is the one that you really want to watch. So we'll go ahead with our first item, audience communication, which is 1. I do not have any blue slips. I don't see anyone rushing up to the table, so we'll move on to item 2, Committee of the Whole. We only have one item, and that's item A, Emergency Operation Plan, and we'll be hearing from Mr. Archibald. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Johnson, members of the board. I asked Mr. Raymond to join us in the event there's any questions or information he may be able to provide in this, but just a little bit of background publicly. And as you know, we reviewed this initially in mid-October. In accordance with state law, the board must adopt an emergency operation plan by January 1 of 2020. The emergency operation plan must be developed and then from that point forward reviewed biannually in conjunction with one law enforcement agency that has jurisdiction over the school district. Last spring, Mr. Raymond worked on putting together an initial emergency operation plan, essentially using our existing plan and incorporating that into the template from the Michigan State Police. He worked on that in conjunction with members of Cabinet, members of the Safety Committee, members of the Livonia Police Department, and that grant was used in submission for a safety grant, you may recall, which we received. And then in just following up on this legislation, Mr. Raymond's continued to refine the emergency operation plan, again with all those individuals that I mentioned previously. We shared an initial draft of it with you in October. We've reviewed it with Cabinet. We've reviewed it with our administrative leadership team, members of the District Safety Committee, and we are prepared this evening at a later point to provide you again with a more in-depth overview. For the public's benefit, again, we've maintained an emergency plan in our district for, I'm going back to the early 2000s, if not earlier than that. And so as a result of this, there isn't anything in our safety procedures and protocols that is essentially changing. It's coming up with a more consistent or common language used in law enforcement and first responders. And the contents of the book will include school violence and attacks, threats of school violence, bomb threats, fire, weather-related emergencies, intruders, parent and pupil reunification, threats at school-sponsored events that may not necessarily be on site. And again, we've had plans in place to cover all of these things, and it's just a matter of now incorporating it into the emergency operation plan modeled after the state police version. Mr. Raymond, is there any?
I think you covered it all, Mr. Archibald.
I couldn't agree more. Questions?
Mrs. Byrne.
In reading through this plan, there are different folks that have different responsibilities.
Yes, ma'am.
Are those reviewed annually, more often than that? Less, how often are our staff reviewing what's supposed to happen in the event?
When you say different folks, are you addressing the incident command system, or are you talking about the
Yes.
different roles throughout the?
Exactly. It appears that our teachers have a role, obviously our administrators have a role, our support staff has a role, et cetera.
I want to say, at least annually, at the beginning of the school year, we put out a document via the internet to all our staff members as a review, as a quick overview for what their role is within the plan itself. We have been doing professional development days, training within that throughout the year.
Okay.
So depending what their role is within the plan, their training is more often,
Okay,
or can be more defined.
got it. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Other questions? Mrs. Jarvis?
Thank you. I had a question about training for staff who is hired mid-year and weren't at the professional development session. Is there some kind of accommodation for that?
All the staff are required to do the annual training, which is a module online, which will lead them through all of the things that are covered in the red emergency flip book, which really, that is the day-to-day quick reference guide that our staff would use in the event of emergency. So if you're talking about folks who are out in the building and working, it really is guiding them through that book. The larger emergency operation plan is a little bit higher level, and Mr. Raymond may agree with me, or hopefully will. Not necessarily something that we're using during an event, but something that we use in preparation for it. So again, they do cover that as part of the pre-employment process.
No matter what time.
No matter what time of the year they're hired. We also, as things occur in other locations and the safety-related things, we always take that opportunity to review those circumstances against our practices and procedures and have discussion either at a building level, at a principal level, at a cabinet level. And so in today's climate, we're really continuously reviewing our safety procedures.
Any other questions? Mrs. Frank?
Just so the red binder that you prepared is really, from what I understand, is really so that everyone is on the same page as well as our law enforcement. It's really to be available to our law enforcement so everyone knows is on the same page for the district. Is that correct? That's really what the red binder was for, so that it's not necessarily new information, but it's things that we've learned and we've changed from different incidences, and then put it all together.
Yes, we're adapting their protocols, so we, for lack of a better word, speak the same language as they do.
Okay.
They deal with this day in and day out.
Right.
When they show up here, they want to know that we're going to follow their lead, their direction.
Right, right,
And this basically spells it out in their language.
right, okay.
I think one of the other things, as Mr. Archibald said, this was a template. This was a template provided by the Michigan State Police and required from every school district in Michigan. And so if you do have an incident which requires response from many different jurisdictions, you would be working along at least a similar process, because each school district is required to complete this.
Other questions? The binder that's here, who has those?
Once it's finally approved and we have it produced, it will go out to minimally all members of cabinet, all members of the administrative leadership team, which includes all the building administrators, as well as we'll make additional copies available in each building for members of the crisis response teams who may not be administrators.
Do our police and fire have copy of this as well?
They do not yet, but we can share a copy with them. Mr. Raymond?
Yes, they have reviewed this as part of our protocol, or not the protocol, but they have reviewed this and coordinated with us on this.
And we'll distribute once the board has voted on
To
this.
approve that, okay. Mrs. Benefield?
How often are the go bags and the red flip folders, how often does somebody go through, or who goes through the buildings to make sure that all that stuff is in place, it's where it's supposed to be, someone hasn't borrowed something out of it?
I want to say in the fall, well, at the beginning of the school year. The red flip books, they should be prominently displayed in every classroom, generally by the door. We've incorporated that in part of our annual internet training, if you will.
Okay.
They've reviewed that, made sure, and they're signing off that, yes, my information, my personal red flip book is current and consistent. So if they move rooms, they're expected to open up the book, make sure that it's completed. You'll see things in there like, where's the closest fire extinguisher, where's the building AED at? They're expected to open it up, make sure it's filled out, make sure that they're familiar with that information. And they
Okay.
sign off on it every year.
Okay.
I happened to be at an elementary school a few weeks back when they were having an evacuation drill, and all the teachers were carrying the red flip book, and they had used the red side and the green side. We're holding up the green side to indicate that they had all the students with them and everything was okay, so the administrator was able to make a visual check down the line.
Oh, very nice.
Right.
Very nice.
Mrs. Bradford?
That was my question. Every teacher gets the red flip book, but the administrators have the actual larger binder.
And some members
Crisis.
of the crisis response team
Okay,
as
that
well.
was my question. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions or comments? So we will be going into, Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you. If we were possibly to suggest a change or a modification or an addition, is there a protocol for doing that to the binder?
We'll do that in closed session.
Okay.
This evening, so just for the public, we are going into closed session, as our meeting notice says, to consider security planning to prevent potential threats to the safety of the students and staff. And so that is, we have that ability under the Open Meetings Act to have the board go into closed session with members of cabinet. So the three of us will be meeting with the board team. You've had a couple of weeks to review this, and we asked you to bring back questions or suggestions or modifications, and we'll go into a little bit more detail about our security planning and processes. For obvious reasons, those are not things that we would go through publicly, but we would be happy to take those suggestions when we meet in closed session, Mrs. Jarvis, and then we'll take all of that information and then feedback from our cabinet team or ALT, now that they've reviewed this, and then make the final version of the EOP.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you gentlemen a little bit later. That'll take us to item 3 on our agenda, which is our Building and Site Committee, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Centers, our chair.
All right, we have 2 items this evening, and Mr. Francis will be joining us to speak to those issues. The first one, Mr. Terrill will be joining us as well, and that is the sinking fund timeline.
So we appreciate this opportunity to spend some time with all of you in updating our community. We were fortunate to have the support of our community once again this past August when we passed the sinking fund millage. As you know, one of the changes that we requested of our community was the ability to go out for that levy for a 10-year period. And as we shared with you and as we shared with our community in many meetings throughout that process, one of the benefits of doing so would allow us to take our long-term facility plan assessment and put that into a long-term sinking fund implementation plan and really go out further than we have been able to do so in the past. We've always requested renewal of that in 5-year increments. This has really been an exciting opportunity for us to really look in a long-term picture of the big 3. As you recall, we talked during the campaign about the big 3 of roofs, boilers, and parking lots. Certainly, those aren't the only things for which we will be using sinking fund dollars, but those were the main areas of focus. What we're bringing to you this evening is a detailed plan that talks about the implementation of each of those over the next 10 years. And before we get started, the one caveat I do want to share with you, as you can imagine, there will be many things that will impact the flow of the implementation of this plan. And some of that might be the condition of a roof or a boiler that may vary from that of which we have today. That might require us to move something up on the list or move something back on the list. We'll continue to look at cash flow. And so what we're sharing with you tonight is a draft, and it is something that will be continuously updated, in all likelihood twice a year. We'll continue to update you, and then we'll spend some time this evening also on a more detailed 3-year plan. So we've created the 10-year plan, to which we spoke about with the community, and we will also share with you a more detailed 3-year sinking fund plan. So I'll turn it over to my colleague so we can get started.
I'd like to just start off by reiterating what Mrs. Oquist had mentioned regarding that the 10-year plan is really not for posting. It's really an internal document that we're working through, because there's no real true way that in 10 years from now, we're going to know with absolute precision. But we have a plan, and it's based upon what we see as the way we would want to replace roofs, replace boilers, do paving projects, et cetera, as we know the knowledge we have now. And as the board knows, and as the community knows, if they've been following the meetings over the past couple of years, we've had extensive investigations on our roof. We hired RTA to do that work, and using that information, the research we've done with the boiler projects, we started with Frost and piloted that for a couple of winters, and as well as, of course, NTH has been a long partner with designing and doing civil engineering with regard to paving projects. So we've put together a plan based upon what we believe is the best way, again, with the knowledge that we have today. So this isn't something that we want to put on the refrigerator with a magnet and say, everybody watch this for the next 10 years, it's going to look just like this. That's why the 3-year plan is much more accurate, because we know in 2020 what we're doing. We're already talking about the designs for 2021, and then we have as that third piece, even though it's a little bit further out, the idea of what we want to do in 2022. So again, I just want to reiterate that point, because it's important to know that things will very likely change in areas based upon new information or changes in conditions, et cetera. We did invite Mr. Terrell here from Plant Moran Cressa, and Allison Smith, everybody knows, the Director of Finance. The three of us, along with some other folks, have been working on, of course, folks in my department, Mr. Smith from Plant Moran Cressa, Mrs. Oquist has been involved. There's been several of us all working on some of these plans. So it's really been a team effort and a combination of inputs. So I appreciate everybody's help along the way. I'll actually, do you have anything to kick off, or
No.
Paul, do you want to just jump in with the start?
Sure. Do you want to go through the tenure or
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We'll go to that kind of high level.
So as Mr. Francis said, we really had the whole team working on this. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've really tried to be a lot more strategic about how we tackle some of the projects that are out in front of us. As you know, we hired a roofing consulting firm to come out and take cores and do some due diligence work on all the roofs in the district to understand exactly what we had. We've done the same thing with NTH, with civil engineering side of evaluating all the parking lots and trying to understand what the long-term needs would be. I keep reminding the group that everything has a life cycle to it, and even though we just replaced some things in the last 5 years, if you go far enough out into the future, we'll end up having to do some maintenance work and some replacement work on even some of those things. Really depends a lot on the weather, especially for the paving projects, depending on how much frost gets into the ground and how harsh the winters are with plows and things like that. On the roofs, those last typically 20 to 25 years. Again, depending on weather and UV and ice damage and things like that, there may be some preventative maintenance and things we need to do to protect that investment for the community. So, and then boilers are typically a little bit longer life cycle, mostly because they're inside the building and protected. And you guys have a great crew of mechanical and electrical tradesmen that monitor those things on a daily basis and make sure that they're running properly with all the chemical treatments and things. So, so really we've been trying to prioritize a little bit and understand over the next 10 years, where do we think the market will be? Over the last, really since the Great Recession, costs have slowly started to come up, and then really over the last 6 or 7 years, they've escalated pretty steeply, much more so than typically. So we're trying to take that into account as well, of where we think the market will be. Part of the nice part of having this 10-year plan is to be able to look out and say, we know roofing went up considerably, what's the best time to bid roofing out? What's the best time to bid out the paving projects? What's the best time for the market to bid out boiler projects? And then working backwards to try to figure out when should we start design, or even before that, when should we bring our plan for the next year to the board and the administration and make sure everyone's on the same page before we start designing so that we hit that sweet spot. So there's a lot of different angles and things that we've considered. Really, if you look at this format, you can see we've got about $70 million or so over the next 10 years if you aggregate everything up. If you look at the first column that says total budget net present value, that's essentially in today's dollars. And then if you look at the years 2020 through 2030, those are escalated with basically compounding 4% escalation, which if you get out to year 10 ends up to be a pretty substantial number. And in the far right column is adding together all the compounded numbers, essentially in those years' dollars.
One thing I want to jump in on, and I should have mentioned before, is we've talked about the facility plans that we have, and the board, we've gone through some of those and showed you examples of buildings, et cetera. That also helped guide this. There is far more in those plans with regard to needs than there is on here. We really, this isn't even everything that we could rattle off for items that we know that need to be done. What we tried to, and I think Mrs. Oquist alluded to this at the beginning, the big three that we've talked about for quite some time now, roofs, boilers, and paving, is what we've really tried to look at here. So you may think of some things that we've discussed or you know, chatted about in the past, or maybe saw from one of those actual buildings of specific facility assessment sheets. There's certainly more need than what is shown here. It's just my point, because this is trying to hone in on the sinking fund.
And I'll jump in there just to remind everybody, when we were going out for the sinking fund, we knew that the sinking fund wasn't going to be able to cover all of our physical plant needs. But we, again, wanted to be respectful of our community and what could be supported by the community. So what this plan is here is saying, based on the dollars we anticipate bringing in each year, what are the projects that we could tackle with that sinking fund revenue?
And that really was a consideration, not only dollar-wise, and I think you can see that, how we've mapped that out each year. So what income will we have, what revenue will we generate from the sinking fund? So what can we manage in one year, as well as what can we physically manage being done, as opposed to 10 roofs in one summer. What can we physically manage on site, as well as dollar-wise. So really, those were two of the large drivers that helped us determine this plan. And then obviously, the assessment of the condition of the roofs, the boilers, and the parking lot helped us determine what order. So do you want to just walk through an example and just take them across one of these areas?
Sure. So if you look at the roofing projects in yellow at the top, that's at Emerson, LCTC, and then Rosedale, those are, I believe the bids in
Their design, we'll be bringing that, the timing wasn't working on when the bids are being opened for December, so we'll be bringing that in January.
But you can see the cost for those. Obviously, Emerson's a bigger roof than the other two. The other thing that we didn't show, because we would have been using 24 by 36 paper, is these numbers are essentially the whole budget rolled together. So it includes the construction costs, contingency, design fees, permit costs, kind of all the little soft costs, ancillary pieces and parts. And then we're just kind of showing the rolled up budget number. So we're pretty confident that that's where these will come in based on the last few years of data that we have. You never know exactly. Again, it depends on how you time the market. It depends on how busy everyone is. The economy has obviously stayed strong and hasn't taken a dip that we thought it would have maybe a couple of years ago. And then the other thing is, over a 10-year period of time, you don't always know what code changes will come up, as we've talked about with the roofing insulation before. The energy code keeps changing every couple 3 years, and that can have a big impact on things like lighting and mechanical units, boilers, controls, that type of thing. So, but you can see for roofing, we're planning on Emerson, LCTC, and Rosedale. The following year, Riley, Randolph, and Hayes. And then as you keep going on, you'll see that we stop using specific building names intentionally, although we had some in mind, we know that things will change faster than we want to put on a piece of paper 10 years out.
And as I mentioned previously, 2020 is fairly locked in. We've got those on the street right now. 2021, while there obviously could be a change up of some sort based upon whatever that might be. Oh my goodness, this other thing is now taking precedent. We might need to pull one of these back, but we're feeling very confident that that's what we're going to have designed and be working towards for 2021. So in a 2-year period, we feel very confident. Just like if you go back a year ago, we were already talking about doing the roof at Emerson, doing the a couple smaller roofs. We already were talking about when we get to paving where we were going to be doing those. So it's a nice. So this sheet is a very nice one to have to kind of look and continue to roll that over year.
So do we want to give the board, why don't we give you a few minutes to take a look at this large spreadsheet and really just take in each year and the number of projects. You can see annually what the cost totals are. So the first block is the roofing, second are the boiler projects, and on the back, you'll see the paving projects as well as some miscellaneous projects that we know at least for the next year or two. And then, as you know, we put aside approximately $300,000 for a wide variety of maintenance projects across the district. We've long done that with the sinking fund. And then we also know we have some large-scale water main replacement work that needs to be done over the next few years as well. So President Johnson and Chairperson Centers, would that be all right with you if we just took a few minutes and let the board take a look through this?
Absolutely.
Do you talk about the gap in paving?
I was actually going to bring that up when we came back together.
Okay.
Definitely. You'll likely notice that after this coming summer in 2020, with regard to paving, 2021 and 2022, we have a gap there. We don't have any budgets in there. That was done purposefully for a couple of reasons. One, we've been doing a lot of paving year over year, and it's the big portion of that, or I should say the big theme of doing that paving was to follow up buildings that were renovated with then a paving project. The big machinery is now off of them, you come in, you do the paving. It's a good break. This summer, we're gonna be bringing to you, as you know, Jackson, Nigiero, which were both recently renovated, and Johnson, which we've been holding off because we did the roof last year. We were gonna do it last summer, but we said, let's do the roof, it really, really needs it. So that would be the last round of that theme of following buildings after renovation, since Nigiero was recently finished this summer. So it felt like a good time to sort of take a pause from the paving projects, and it helped us turn our attention both fiscally as well as just with the projects to the boilers for a couple of summers to pretty much knock through those, and then we could come back. We don't want to take too long of a break, but I think 2 years is not too long, and it can help the district again sort of recenter, refocus, look at what our plans are. We have paving that hops up the year after that in the third year, and we do have planned items, but it would still give us the time to see where we're at and what the best plan of attack at that point is.
The nice thing about doing the boilers quickly is there's a direct payback there on the energy efficiency that we gain. So it should help put money back in the general fund the faster we can get the boilers replaced.
Mrs. Bradford.
Thank you. I did notice on the boilers, it ends in 2023. Will there be anything in those subsequent years for repairing any type of contingency or something in case we need to do repair? Because I noticed it just dropped.
No, because.
We won't.
Just to say, hopefully not for the, that's all right, hopefully not for the boilers, but there were quite a few mechanical units that we didn't replace or weren't able to replace in the past that we could potentially revisit, and especially, again, if it's gonna drive energy efficiency,
Okay.
returns on investment, that may make sense.
This being the sinking fund, you can replace and you can repair, but you can't maintain using the sinking fund.
Oh,
And being so
okay.
young, we would be maintaining them
Okay.
in a regular protocol, but hopefully.
Not replacing.
not
We're repairing them,
Not
we're gonna be
replacing.
calling
Yeah.
the warranty.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Mrs. Burden.
Under boiler projects, it looks like the Franklin High School is the only one that says boiler/steam conversion. Is that the last steam system that we have in the district, and we're converting it over to the boilers that we have in the rest of the district?
Correct.
Okay. And then, can you remind me what's going on with the LCTC water main replacement?
That is an item that we had originally brought up as a discussion last year, and we had set it aside at that time for several reasons, not the least of which was the timing. We were trying to get it in with the paving projects, and it just was, we were rushing it. We didn't want to rush it. So we do have, if you look at your 3-year, the smaller sheet, we do have a water main replacement scheduled in 2021. We have 2 buildings that still have that water main that needs to be addressed. One is LCTC, the other one is Johnson. The presumption, as we sit here today, on December 9th of 2019, is that will very likely be LCTC. So.
Okay. Now, and that water main is our property, not the city property? I mean, I always just think of water mains as being part of the city's responsibility.
No, if you think of LCTC when you're on Newburgh, looking up that whole huge stretch of land, it runs all the way up through there. It's on our property.
So the main going down the street is probably the city's, but the loop around the building would be the district's.
Okay. And what's going on with that that's not going on in our other buildings right now? I'm sorry, if we've discussed this, I don't remember. What's going on with
Most
that
of the
water
other
main that's
buildings have
causing this
loops
problem?
already.
Oh, yeah, this one actually, it's just, it hasn't been addressed. We had 3 at one point. We did Holmes. We want to address the LCTC and the Johnson. They're old, and there's a concern that we want to get to them before, to get the replacement before
Okay.
it actually has a
It
fault.
flows.
Mhm.
Okay. All
So,
right.
I mean, there's not an emergency with it right now. It's one of those planned projects where we say, we know we're getting to end of life. Let's try to do it before we have an emergency situation.
I
Okay.
believe it's the original water main from
I
where the
believe
building
it
was
is as
built,
well.
right?
Mhm.
So
it
it's
was from the
50 years old.
1960s or so?
Yeah.
That building was done in 71, I believe.
We got our money's worth on that.
71, so, yeah.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Mrs. Frank.
Just a couple of things. I think although that this plan is not 100% and it's going to change over the next couple of years, I think going out for the 10-year sinking fund, and maybe Ms. Okos can speak a little bit more about it, although it will change and we don't know what the needs will be, I think it allows us to plan more accurately for this year. And even as we look at the timelines, each of these projects take a long time to do. So although they're, just paving projects by the time you design and have the review and that sort of thing, they are long-term. So if we continue to go for a 5-year plan, although we know what we're doing for the next 5 years, it is hard to plan and know exactly what's coming down the pike. And if we have availability to do to the roofs next time, correct? Is that what I'm?
Absolutely, and really, once you get to about that 3rd or 4th year, you're really holding off
Yes.
doing a whole lot of planning for the next year or two, because you're waiting to see if that revenue
Right.
will continue to come into the district
Right.
via the sinking funds. So, and it also allows us to plan out with contractors and get some economies of scale when we're talking about letting companies know the amount of work we need to do over the next 10 years. So there are, a wide number of benefits, not the least of which it really does allow us to dig deeply into what the needs are, be able to plan cash flow, as well as the projects, which is why you see that 2-year gap in paving. If we were only doing 3 or 4 years at a time, we might have just added, continuously just went on the paving cycle. But when you take a look at it, and you need to, in aggregate, have all of those dollars not exceed what we're going to be bringing in, then you realize, okay, if we're gonna move up the boilers and put a little bit more steam behind that, so to speak, so that we can get those all in the next 3 years, that means we're gonna have to back off paving a little bit, which really we are able to do because we've been able to do so much via the bond.
Right.
So this has really allowed us, our team, to take a really deep look at, one, what the needs are, and two, how we're gonna manage that cash flow over that period of time.
Perfect. And then my other question was, Mr. Francis, are we, and I know that this is high level, but for any of the paving projects, I know that landscape has changed in terms of when the buildings were built. Most people were either bused or walked, and now we have a lot more drivers, we have a lot more parents, and a lot more cars coming through. So when we're looking at paving projects, is there anything in here that says we're going to just reformulate how the parking lots are, or is the sinking fund only for replacing what we currently have?
The way we budgeted to the best of our ability, moving out that far, we pretty much are taking the square footage that we have, and we put a dollar amount, much like the roofs where you have a certain square footage, we're taking a dollar amount per square foot and getting those dollars. These can change based upon conditions, as everybody on this board knows.
Right.
We did some buildings with paving, then turned around and went back to try to address a need for families at a few of our elementaries. If that comes up as we're closer, and that's a conversation that we find that is in need, or if, say, we've budgeted for not full depth, we thought at the time a mill and cap might be sufficient, but we would have to do more full depth, which is more expensive. That would also be something that we could address at that time, and maybe a building comes off because we have to put more dollars towards a different building. So this is a very nice placeholder. As we get closer, as a team, we can address those questions, and then of course the board can also, give some guidance on that as well.
Yeah, so while we have a long-term plan, we also have a lot of short-term flexibility in how we implement it, especially with the contracts we've got. Obviously, we talked about NTH and RTA and some people where we've used our volume to leverage a more economical design fee or price from them. And in the event that we're happy with that, we can keep going and renew that year to year. Or in the event we weren't, we could then go out and seek RFPs and proposals and things. It's worth mentioning too that all the construction will be competitively bid. So the more we can go out and get good roofing contractors to bid, good paving contractors to bid, good mechanical contractors to bid, that should drive down costs too. So.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just want to spend a minute on the bottom of this sheet, if we could just, I think we're done with the big sheet, if we could just spend a couple quick minutes on the 8.5 by 11 sheet. We want to just talk about process with you for a moment and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, so go ahead.
Yeah, you can see the colored, grid. That's nothing that's any difference, just giving the specificity from 2020 to 2022. But at the bottom, in this, it feels like we might even feel the rhythm of this already, because this is somewhat of the rhythm that we use. But to point out for the board, this is the process that we have been and we want to continue to try to stick to with regard to planning, design, bidding, bringing to the board, getting everything put together and actually doing the job. You can see it's more than a year's process from soup to nuts, from saying we want to do X, and then 16 to 18 months later, buttoning up with some type of punch list, or depending on what the project is. So, just to kind of run through, and like I said, you might even feel like this looks familiar, because as we've already said, January we're going to bring roofing, in February we'll be bringing paving, bids. So we're already sort of in this, but just for everyone, we talk about updating the plans. We both will be updating this 3-year plan, as well as twice a year. Our aim is to update the full facility plan. We've already been sort of on a winter, summer cadence with that. And so come design, and that's basically in the springtime, and come design, we do take several months of design on these projects, and we bring in principals with regard to paving and with regard to the roof and get input, and it gets redrawn, et cetera. So you see here, we have April through October. And then we get into that fall period of putting it out on the street, and we can bid. And generally, we want to get those back and awarded somewhere in December, January, February time period. Now, if we learn that perhaps doing something earlier or later will be beneficial to the district, we of course would make those adjustments. And then to finish that off, you're talking about in the spring, having the material procurement, meaning we do the contracts, the vendor or the contractor is getting their materials set up, and then when school is let out, we have, you'll start seeing in June, the roofers going and staging in areas or doing things like that. And then really, once we come back, August, September, October, we're wanting to button that up with any final punch list items and finish out before winter comes again. And then by the time we're doing that in September, October, November, we're already well into the design phase for the next summer's projects. So we're doing a little bit of double time at that point. Did you want to add anything on that?
No, really, it just is a matter of that small construction window that we have, wanting to time the bidding market at the right point in time, and then just wanting to keep the board informed as to what our plans are on an ongoing basis. So really, we're just kind of following that cycle. It's very similar to what we've been doing with the bond and the sinking fund projects.
Any questions regarding projects, cash flow, or the plan that we're proposing using and updating?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, item 2 is walking paths.
At the study session, I brought this up originally with the board. I wanted to revisit it and bring it to your attention again, is that next, and then hopefully put it on for the regular meeting next week. We had our K-6 walking paths that were designed with input from the buildings. That was principal, and they also may have brought in someone like the PE teacher or someone along those lines who was familiar with working on the playgrounds. They did where they wanted the walking path to be. We had bid that out. Best had won that bid as the low responsible bidder, and over the spring and summer, we had done the walking paths. The board had approved $175,110, I think if I'm remembering correctly, and another $10,000 for contingency for that project. We have change orders in totality from all the buildings that totaled $53,250. The $10,000 in contingency that was already approved by the board has been used towards that. So I am coming back and asking for approval of the $43,250. So the question is an obvious one of how did we get to that amount. So we'll back up a little bit in our story and say when we have buildings, they gave us where they were interested in having their walking path. We had done a pre-bid walkthrough with anybody that was going to, or interested in bid. We generally do mandatory pre-bid walkthroughs, so anybody that is interested, they need to come, see the project, so they can't say after they bid, oh, I didn't know what that was gonna look like. And we did, once we had the Best was on board as the contractor, Mr. Lau and representatives from Best, and invited a principal from each building as well, visited the building, walked the area where the path was hopeful to be, wheeled it out to get the linear footage to try to get the total cubic feet of the fill, because really all the cost is, not all the cost is linear, but it's based upon the per cubic foot of what we were doing. So if it gets smaller, it gets cheaper, and if it gets bigger, it's more expensive. So one item which was a decent size on its own was the miscommunication with one of our elementaries as to whether they were needing a walking path or not. Miscommunication, it wasn't in the bid. We immediately said, we're gonna be doing it still. So, absolutely. Everything we did basically was to try to make sure that the schools had the best possible opportunity to have the best walking path they wanted for the kids to benefit. So then, as the project laid out, even though we had walked it, everybody had been there, we had wheeled it out to get the sizing, once the project began, there were points in it where there was either a low point or a tree or something that was that had to deviate from the original path. And in almost every case, if not every single case, we always defaulted to a larger path than a smaller path. Again, we wanted to try to have the default be whatever was better for the playground area and the students that would use it. So the ultimate amount of footage grew. So about 18 to 20,000 alone was the one building that was not in the original bid, and the remainder was all the change in the footage.
All right, questions? All right.
I mean, we do, and I apologize, and I'll answer your question, but let me jump in, because I think someone asked the question last week about how the budget is, and we knew that we also did have money still. This was all from the bond playground line item, and we knew that we did have money in there. And when it's all said and done, frankly, it would be 20,000 over from like a over $2 million budget.
It was a $2.3 million budget.
Yeah, that was,
I'm all
okay.
set. That's what I was meant.
Yeah, so the scope's gonna be a little bigger, and we're just going back and adding a little bit, so. Great. Thank you, Mr. Francis.
Can I put it on
So we'd like to
regular,
put that on regular
Thank you.
agenda.
Thank you. All right, have a good evening.
That concludes building and site, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Centers. That will then take us to, let's see, our item 4, our curriculum committee, and I'll turn it over to our chair, Mrs. Jarvis.
Thank you, President Johnson. Tonight we'll invite Mrs. O'Brien to come and tell us about the school index scores.
Good evening, how are you?
Hello there.
I'm good, thank you. This is just an informational item this evening. As you know, the state has our accountability index scores that come out each year, and this past week they came out for review. So the information is embargoed, so I can't share with you specific information until it becomes public. But I did want to share with you that in going through all of them, most of our schools, so if you remember, first of all, the index scores have 6 components. So let me just go over those quickly. It has a proficiency piece to it, a growth piece of it, a school quality component, which actually has absenteeism. It has, do students have access to art, PE, library media specialists? Do we offer course advance work? Do we have students going on to post-secondary enrollment? 10% of it is graduation rate, how we work with our EL students, and then a percent of our test participation. So this is that dashboard. It's part of the parent dashboard, but it's also a separate piece that has our index scores on it. So like I said, the last week was an opportunity to dig in and look at it before it goes to the public, and it won't be coming out until next year, early 2020. But I wanted to make you aware that we do have one of our schools that has been designated as a targeted school because they have one of their subgroups that is, the gap is too large. And so between all students scoring on state assessments and how that subgroup scored. So they are below the 5% mark, and so you can get targeted, let me use the exact word, targeted support if you have one subgroup, and then if you have multiple, you could go to comprehensive support. And they have different designations by the state. Last year we did not have any that were designated as either one of them, but we will have one this year. And so when the data comes out, I will share that with you. But I wanted you to know and be aware of that. And then the process for all of this hasn't changed from last year. So then we will make a plan with that school on how to work with that subgroup and improve their scores.
So just a reminder, a subgroup is a group of 30 or more students. So if you had 7 students of a particular subgroup, and subgroups could be anything from male and female to economically disadvantaged, English language learners, special education, gender, ethnicity.
Yep.
But any subgroup population that is 30 or greater, the state looks at the performance of that subgroup in comparison to the population as a whole in your school. And there's an allowable differential between the two, and when they believe that that differential is too great, what they say is, we're going to have you target support in a particular area to close that gap. Yeah.
Are there any questions? Mrs. Frank?
Is this the dashboard, like where you get A through F? Is that what this is, or this is a different?
So this is our current model for accountability. It does not have letter grades.
Okay.
So you know that it was passed that we would have letter grades. So currently, right now, they haven't merged,
Okay.
and we don't have the ABCD at this point. So this, we have a point scale for each one of those components. So student growth, student proficiency, school quality, graduation rates. You get a score for each one of those, and then you get an overall score for a school. So your overall score could be very good, and you still have too big of a gap between how most or all of your students, your average scoring is, and a certain group of students that is not there.
Mrs. Bradford?
Thank you. When does the letter grade system begin?
So we're hearing that it's coming out early next year. They're just trying to decide, since that law got passed, are we going to have two side-by-side parallel? So we don't believe in giving, it sounds like what they're saying is they don't believe in giving one overall grade for a school. So X school is a B. But what it sounds like is that they will take the dashboard in each of these components, possibly give each component a letter grade. So possibly have a letter grade for student growth, for student proficiency, for school quality, graduation rate, like that. That's where they're at right now.
Mrs. Frank?
When you say proficiency, what tests are they using? Is that what testing is that?
All tests. So
All tests. So we have to report iReady or no?
no.
Okay.
So all state tests. So
Okay.
M-STEP, My Access, SAT, PSAT. So
Okay.
all state tests.
Okay.
So, Mrs. O'Brien, this is that dashboard that you took us through a while back, step by step, that the parents were allowed to have input on and to give feedback about. Are they still accepting feedback on that?
There is a contact us portion right on each school's dashboard. And so if there's a question or a concern about something, you can contact MDE and let them know.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Burke?
We've discussed subgroups with our Board of Education many, many times, but for those in our public who are tuning in, subgroups may be referring to groups such as English language learners, students with learning disabilities, and some of the others. I'm sorry, remind me some of the others.
So any group of students that you can sort your data by. So you can do it by gender. We get our data by boys and girls. We get it by our ethnicity. We get by certain identifiers. So like you said, an English learner, if I'm economically disadvantaged, if I have an IEP, so I'm a special education student. I think that's it.
Okay. And by their very nature, larger schools are going to have more subgroups because we have more students.
Correct.
It would not be appropriate to compare a large school district and their subgroup situation with a small school district or a small school and their subgroups, because simply by the numbers of students, they won't hit that 30
Correct.
in any one subgroup.
Correct.
So this is something that, frankly, large schools and schools that will have a more diverse population are going to experience, by their very nature, more subgroups.
Absolutely. And, we look at all of our students when we are looking at our data, and we look at each group of students, whether there's 30 or not. Dr. Terrill and DOI, we look at how those students are performing on their assessments and say, what do we need to be doing to support them? Mrs. Pearson, who's our federal programs person, we're looking at our English learners and how they're performing in our schools. So we look at those groups all the time.
Right.
When the state identifies a group and then shows their state results and gives you that information, and then is going to put it out there. We just wanted to make sure that you are aware that we have that.
And one other question, you said
Sure.
that one of our schools can get targeted support. Is that financial support that's going to come from the state in order to help us give additional support to this group of students? Or the state is simply identifying this group of students and saying, our district needs to do, frankly, what we're already doing, which is
Right.
putting every effort we can into helping this group that may struggle for one reason or another to
We'll solidify a plan and share it with them, but yes, it'll be on the district to work with that school to support that group of students and make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that they are able to show what they know on our state assessments.
Okay.
And likely have increased reporting requirements.
Okay. And likely going to be doing all the things we're doing without the state identifying that, because we have already identified it ourselves, that
It
these
is,
are
and as far
students
as we
who are
know, there are no
struggling.
dollars that come along with this.
No.
Okay,
Yeah.
all righty.
No.
Okay, thank you.
Mrs. O'Brien, is it possible that there is a group, a subgroup, that could be identified as being targeted for additional support, that the previous year still had the same needs but didn't have 30 students? And so it was
Certainly.
not identified by the
Certainly.
state?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Those numbers could change just by how big the subgroup is.
Correct.
Yes.
This particular one that we're discussing tonight is possibly then a group that may have needed support last year, but the state didn't recognize them because of their size. And the same thing could happen next year. We could have a group this year that simply falls between the cracks this year on the state's records. But in our district, we still take a look at that, and we're still addressing those needs.
Correct. At Division of Instruction, and then we bring it to CAMNet, we're always looking at all of our students, so all of our groups of students at our buildings. Schools, when they do their school improvement plans, do the exact same thing. They take their state data results and they dig deeper and they say, so how are our kids doing? How are our boys doing compared to our girls? So we already do that every year when our assessment data comes out.
Thank you. Mrs. Frank?
One more just complicated piece that's complicated with this, is this correct, is that although they point out that subgroup that is low, we cannot, in the classroom, to my understanding, pull all the girls. If the female subgroup is low, can't pull out all the girls to just teach to the girls, correct? I mean, we can't just identify that subgroup, or can we with your staff? Can you pull out just the kids that are struggling or not, because it's based upon a subgroup?
So that's why we use multiple pieces of data in a classroom so that it's aligned to the classroom instruction. So, you brought up iReady as an example. So, we may get state testing data on a group of students. And so then we're going to dig deeper, and what does that look like at the classroom level? So that if, I have 3 first grade teachers over here that I'm showing them that their students need some additional things, then we're taking that diagnostic and digging in deeper and saying, so what do they need? And so when I do those smaller skill supports, the goal is obviously to raise them to grade level and then their ability to achieve on a state assessment. So we do that. You always start with the biggest assessment, like a state assessment, and then you always whittle it down to what does that look like in the classroom. When M-STEP says, we get writing back, pieces of writing, and kids, maybe it's not clearly connected to the piece of reading that they did. So then in the classroom, what a teacher does is say, so when I'm teaching this kind of writing, I want to make sure I'm aligning my teaching to, we're reading a piece and we're writing about that piece, so that they're doing it at the smaller skill level, which then is going to impact how those students do on the state assessment.
And we do look at subgroups. So let's say English language learners. You can pull English language learners and give them assistance, but you do that based on their performance on the assessments that we do. So you wouldn't necessarily say all English language learners. You would say perhaps English language learners that need support in this area based on their assessment. Same thing with economically disadvantaged students. We have Title I dollars that can be utilized If they're not school-wide, then it's targeted to students who qualify based on their economic status. But again, you wouldn't necessarily pull all economically disadvantaged students. You'd pull those who are having challenges in the classroom, who are at risk for learning success. So you can pull by that subgroup based on the data and based on their needs.
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
Good. President Johnson?
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. Two questions. Am I understanding that the subgroup can span various grade levels?
Not for this particular,
It's all in the same grade level?
yes.
Okay, it's not like, our subgroup isn't scattered amongst, if we're in a K-4, all four grades.
No, it's for that assessment, so it would be for the third grade reading assessment. So
Just-
for that, you'd be
okay.
using the cohort of third graders
grade.
at that school.
Okay,
So I do want to check on that, because I would say that I think that their index score is their third and their fourth grade score
Together.
combined, okay.
Because we get one index score. So so I can get back to you. When the scores
Okay.
are released, I'll make sure I answer that question so that you have that. And then our 5, 6s, it would be both together, because they get one index score. Now, they do, under proficiency and growth, I can dig deeper and look at third grade scores and fourth grade scores. But I think you are correct in that in order to get to the index overall, it's both of them
Okay.
together.
And you said something that led to my second question. It says the scores are available for preview, but they're embargoed until March 1st. What's the purpose of embargoing them until March 1st?
So that a school district can look and see if there's any mistakes.
Okay, it's just sort of a period of,
Appeal.
yeah, sort of an appeal.
Review and appeal.
Okay, if we don't agree with something in there, they give us time to maybe contest it in some
Yeah,
way.
if there's something reported incorrectly.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Thank you, Mrs. O'Brien.
Thank you.
President Johnson, that concludes the curriculum committee report.
Thank you, Mrs. Jarvis. And then that takes us to item 5, our Finance Committee, and I'll turn it over to Mrs. Bonifield.
I have nothing tonight, Mrs. O'Quist.
We do not.
Thank you.
Then we will go to item 7, our Policy Committee, Mrs. Burton.
I don't believe we have anything tonight, Heather?
We
Mrs.
don't.
Otis? No.
And we'll go to item 7, our Legislative Committee, Mrs. Bradford.
I do not have anything to report on. Do you, Mrs. O'Quist?
We do, well, other than that, what I shared with you the
Yes.
past few days, that we're awaiting a final decision and signature on the supplemental budget. Unfortunately, they did not take advantage of the opportunity to utilize the tenets of the School Finance Research Collaborative and really impact public education and financing in a meaningful way. So we won't see really any significant differences from what we had budgeted and shared with you previously.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Bradford. Then we'll go to item 8, our Personnel Committee, and Mrs. Frank.
I don't believe we have anything.
We do not.
Thank you.
Very good. Then we are at the end of our agenda for the Committee of the Whole. Do we want to go right into, since we're at 7:35, right into our special meeting agenda?
Sure.
Is everybody good with that?
Sounds good.
All right, then this is the special meeting of December 9th, 2019. And Mrs. Bonifield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes, here.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonifield is here. President Johnson?
Here, we have a quorum. That takes us to item 2, audience communication. I do not see any blue slips. I do not see anyone in the audience. So we're going to move on to item 3, recess to closed session. And may I have a motion, please?
President Johnson.
Mrs. Bradford.
Move that the Board of Education of the Livonia Public Schools School District recess to closed session to consider security planning to prevent potential threats to the safety of the students and staff.
Support.
We have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Bonifield. Are there any questions or comments?
Mr. Johnson, we will not be coming back on camera after this, correct?
That's correct. All right, we have a motion by Mrs. Bradford, supported by Mrs. Bonnefield, to recess to closed session. Mrs. Bonnefield, would you take the roll, please?
Mrs. Bradford?
Yes.
Mrs. Bonnefield says yes. Mrs. Burton?
Yes.
Mr. Centers?
Yes.
Mrs. Frank?
Yes.
Mrs. Jarvis?
Yes.
President Johnson?
Yes. Motion carries. We will now go to closed session. Thank you.